on this rather new event and inspired by an action that was proposed by a faculty member across the country at the University of Pennsylvania. We have about 125 people joining us today, which is an amazing turnout. So thank you for taking out the time to join us to discuss this very important issue around race and policing. So I'm Professor Barragan. Our other host is Professor Hanink. And today we'll be talking about the issue of race and policing. But before we get started, I do want to go over some ground rules to help guide today's discussion. So we want to hear from you all. So throughout the course of our presentation, please enter questions in the chat, and we'll be pulling from these questions during the open forum session of today's presentation to generate some ongoing and lively discussion around the topics we'll be discussing. As I mentioned previously, please keep yourself muted. That way we can make sure we could hear everyone and that we're not talking over one another. If there is time at the end, we will ask for students to speak up if they would like to join in the conversation vocally. And if you do decide to do that, remember to raise your hand and not just unmute yourself and speak. There's 130 people now in this forum. So unless you're called upon to speak, don't unmute yourself. And hopefully we'll have some time at the end to allow for that type of participation as opposed to just the chat participation. A couple other things to keep in mind is an open mind. We will be talking about some pretty sensitive and politicized and difficult topics. So keep an open mind if people bring up perspectives that don't align with your own, and also try to maintain a respectful tone and attitude when addressing the issues that you bring up, and also if you're addressing any of your fellow Broncos. And then lastly, use emoticons to share reactions. We could see the panel and we could see if people put thumbs up or if they put any other kind of emoticon, and that gives kind of a quick way to respond to what we're discussing. So with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and provide a little bit more background about why we're actually here today. So for those of you that aren't familiar with what the Scholar Strike is, it's a two-day action that was started by Anthea Butler at the University of Pennsylvania to call awareness to the racial climate in America, and particularly to racialized police violence and how we as academics can be thinking about and organizing around these issues within our campuses. Kevin Gannon from Grandview University joined Butler, and they're the ones that really created this two-day action in the span of about a week and a half. So this is really why we're here today. So CPP Sociology Department decided to take part in this Scholar Strike, and our approach to this action was to organize a teach-in in order to discuss the issue of race and policing. So we have staff like myself and Peter that have studied these issues in depth. And so we wanted to provide a space for students to also have an opportunity to discuss their thoughts, as well as learn some more in-depth information about race and policing that they might not already know. All right, so now to the meat and potatoes of why we're actually here. So as I stated at the outset, we created this event with an explicit understanding that racial violence in the United States is a problem, and particularly that racialized police violence is a problem. So whether or not you follow social media or your local news outlet, you may have heard things as of late that Black people are killed more than white people by police, or that Black people have a higher risk of being killed by police. And the key to unpacking these statements is really understanding the difference between raw numbers and race. So when looking at the raw numbers of how many people are actually killed by police, and this includes shootings, chokeholds, really any other type of force that results in someone's death, when we look just at those raw numbers, like this chart shows here, when looking at the US population, about 48% of those people that are killed are white, yet they represent 63% of the American population. So this is where we see a disjuncture in terms of representation, because then if we compare it to Black individuals that are killed by police, they represent 27% of those killed, yet only 13% of the US population. And that is why it's true to say that Black individuals are overrepresented when it comes to police killings. We can also see from this chart that they're overrepresented when it comes to those that are unarmed and those that are unarmed and not attacking during the course of whatever event leads to their death by law enforcement. So I really want to just underscore here, kind of, and as we move forward and as you potentially think of questions, that it's important to keep in mind the denominator, so to speak, and what the general population numbers look like, or whatever the population is that you're looking at when trying to make sense of rates versus raw number data when it comes to police killings. So there are a few ways that we can try to make sense of these racial disparities in fatal encounters by police. And two of them focus on what I call individual level explanations for the people that are involved in said fatal encounter. So on the victim side, something we might hear is, they must have done something wrong. So within this type of thinking, we try to make sense of how that individual got to that situation in the first place. And we might say things like, if they had just complied, or if they hadn't run away, maybe they wouldn't have been shot. So all of these statements, however, honest they might be, are loaded with a lot of assumptions as well as hypotheticals. So the data that I provide here come primarily from the Mapping Police Violence Project, but they point to several important counterfactuals when it comes to these types of individual level explanations. So the first is that 63% of police killings were actually initiated by responses to suspected nonviolent offenses, as well as no crimes at all. So the vast majority of the calls that result in police killings aren't in response to what we would think of as a violent crime, say a shootout or a domestic violence dispute. 12% of the victims that were killed in 2017 by police were also unarmed. And of those that were unarmed, they were primarily Black, Indigenous, and Latinos. 55% of the killings that were perpetrated by police also involved people that were not posing a threat with a gun. And what the Mapping Police Violence Project argues is that if police were able to de-escalate these situations in events where there was no actual threat with a firearm, we could have reduced police killings by upwards of 55%. So the second level of explanation has to do with the cops themselves. And the narrative here goes, at least if we accept that there is some responsibility on behalf of the officers, is that these acts are just a reflection of a few bad apples, or even worse, a few racist cops that exist within law enforcement. And so with this level of explanation, I put maybe because it is possible that these explanations are valid, but what makes it hard to actually assess the validity of these types of statements is that there's a lack of access to police officer data in shootings to confirm if these bad apples really are bad apples. So for example, do they have a higher history of use of force complaints? Have they shot other people in the past? Are they defiant of their superiors? So as researchers, we don't typically have access to that data. And part of it is because law enforcement departments don't share that data. And the reasons for not sharing that data are many. It really depends on the state and jurisdiction, as well as local unions. So there's that caveat to keep in mind when making bad apple or thinking about the bad apple argument. And then the second thing to think about is, if we were able to access police officers and survey them about their racial beliefs, would they actually admit explicit bias? They are, after all, sworn to protect, regardless of anyone's background. So we have to keep in mind kind of that hypothetical as well. And then lastly, even if the bad apple argument were true, one of the frustrations that activists are vocalizing at this moment is that, you know, if this is true, why aren't these bad apples removed? We aren't seeing officers get removed from their posts in many of the instances where killings are occurring. And so it leaves open this last question here about what is law enforcement doing to remove these said bad actors. So with that, Peter is now going to take it away by offering some structural level explanations.
All right, thank you so much, Melissa. And wow, I'm so impressed with the turnout today. So I'm Peter Hanink. I am a policing scholar primarily here at Cal Poly Pomona. So this is kind of what I do. This is like the meat and potatoes of the kind of research that I do. And I think that one of the things to start off this discussion, to kind of start off the frame, is this distinction that Melissa makes, I think is so key, of this idea of individual level explanations versus macro level explanations versus systemic structural level explanations. And I think that one of the reasons that distinction is so important is, you know, you can't really have a conversation with people unless you have some sort of shared definitions, some sort of shared sense of what we're talking about. So when we talk about racism, part of the problem that I think so often we have in society today is that, you know, if I say racism, maybe what you hear is what I mean, or maybe what you hear is what you assume. Right? So there's this distinction. And the biggest distinction is, I think, this individual level versus structural level racism. That historically, if we go back to, like, you know, the 60s, 70s, the way we talked about racism, the way that Dr. King talked about racism, it was very much grounded in this idea of ignorance, this idea of a personal failing, a flaw. The racist was the bad person. It was an individual level explanation for what was happening. So if we say, oh, if there's racism in policing, then there must be racist police. And every police officer you talk to is going to say, well, I'm not a racist. And you know what? Probably most of them are being sincere, right? Probably the vast majority of police officers are not intentional, mustache twirling, evil racists. Rather, there's something else going on. And that something else that's going on is what Eduardo Bonilla Silva refers to as racism without racists. This idea that we can have racist structures and racist patterns within society, even if you don't have individual micro-level racists. So how does that work? Well, there's lots of ways that could work in lots of different areas, but I want to focus on policing. Specifically, I want to focus on police violence. So let's think about structurally, systemically, how we could end up with racist outcomes, right? This idea that Melissa started our conversation with, that people of color, specifically African Americans, especially African Americans, are overwhelmingly, disproportionately likely to be victims of police violence. If you look at their populations, like 3 times what we'd expect given their population. If you look at just so it's depending on how you look at it, it's hugely more likely to experience violence. So how does that happen, even if there are not individual level evil racists? Well, the story would go something like this. Because of legacies of segregation, African Americans are more likely to live in segregated neighborhoods. Segregated neighborhoods are more likely to experience over-policing, aggressive policing. That is policing that is looking specifically at every level to stop people, to search them, to find something that's going on, and to make arrests. So at every single level, we have what is sometimes referred to as a pattern of racialized policing. So let's take that first level, that level of stops. One of the things we know is that African Americans are far more likely than whites to be stopped by the police for traffic infractions, and stopped by the police for what's referred to as investigatory stops. That is, stops where the officer has a reasonable suspicion that a crime is occurring or is about to occur. So we know that African Americans are far more likely than whites to be stopped. And when they're stopped, we know that African Americans are far less likely to have something on them, like contraband or a weapon or drugs, when compared to the whites who are stopped. This is sometimes referred to in the policing literature as the hit rate, right? That is, how accurate was your stop? So you had a reasonable suspicion that someone was committing a crime, so you stopped them. Was your hunch right? Was your suspicion right? What we find is that when whites are stopped, the police officer's suspicion is very accurate. That police officers are very good at stopping whites. Because when they stop them, like, yeah, what do they find? They find drugs, they find weapons. It was a good stop. What we find is that when it comes to African Americans and to a lesser extent Latinos, that police officers are less accurate, which means they're stopping them not for good reasons, but for something else. There's something else going on that's contributing to that stop besides the drug possession, weapon possession. Okay, so let's look at then the stop. Okay, so they're more likely to be stopped. Well, what happens after the stop? Well, in the course of the stop, African Americans are far more likely to have force used against them. So when they have force used against them, as Melissa outlined, that force, it could be lethal force, but especially they're more likely to have non-lethal force used against them. So we say non-lethal force, what are we talking about? Well, this is the kind of thing that we're, so things that are short of fire, short of a shooting. And when people say, well, why does non-lethal force, why does that matter as much? I always think, I always want to remind people, look, Eric Garner, Freddie Gray, George Floyd, these were non-lethal uses of force. These were not shootings. What we see is that these are African-American men who have these very low-level predicate offenses, right? Like Eric Garner was selling loosies, right? Like selling like loose cigarettes. George Floyd had a fake 20, which he may or may not have known was a fake 20, right? These are very low-level offenses, and yet we have force that's being used against the person that, again, everyone will say is non-lethal, but the consequence is that they die. So why does this matter? Well, one of my colleagues and I, one of the areas that we're researching is the fact that when it comes to attributions of that police officers and all of us, we're all guilty of this, that all of us are more likely to believe that African Americans can tolerate higher levels of pain than whites. And this has been proven experimentally in surveys. So what's the effect of that? Well, the effect of that is that police officers are more likely to use, even when they're using non-lethal force, more aggressive non-lethal force, which is again how we end up with these disparities. Recall, keep in mind, everything I'm describing at this point, this whole process, none of this requires an individual level like Klansmen. Like, we're not talking about racists who are like, I want to stop black people and I want to hurt black people because I hate black people. Rather, this is the result of patterns that have developed within policing. This is a result of stereotypes and implicit biases that all of us within society carry with us to one extent or another. And the result of this are these huge disparities that we see in who's getting stopped, what's happening when they get stopped, who's having force applied, and how that force is being applied. So back to Melissa.
I was muted. So thank you so much, Peter, for drawing that through line. So now what we're going to transition to is to one question that Peter and I developed together. And then we don't see any questions from the chat, so we'll start with this question first. But now that we've drawn this through line about several potential explanations as to why police violence and lethal violence in particular falls most heavily on Black Americans, we want us to think about together, what are some concrete next steps that we can engage in and that law enforcement departments can engage in, that society can engage in to address racialized police violence. So you want to enter your response in the chat, or if you want to raise your hand. Create trust.
Okay, so Cynthia says create trust. I'm assuming, Cynthia, you mean create trust between the community and the police? Okay, now we got the outpouring of ideas.
It's coming.
It's coming. It's coming. Training.
Yeah, there's
All right.
a lot
Can
of
I
training.
take this one, Melissa?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. So I am a big believer in police reform. I am a huge skeptic of training. So we have this kind of irony within the United States. The irony within the United States is that we require the least amount of training of any of what we think of as our peer countries. So you compare police officers in the United States to their counterparts in the countries that we like to compare ourselves to, right? Like Western Europe, France, Germany, England, the Northern Europe, Scandinavian countries, Canada, New Zealand, Australia. These are Japan. These are the countries we like to compare ourselves to, right? We don't want to compare ourselves to poor countries. We don't want to compare ourselves to violent countries. We like to compare ourselves to industrialized countries in the West and global North. Well, when you compare policing in the United States to policing in the West and the global North, what you see is that our police officers have far less training than so many of their counterparts in other countries. So you might say, okay, well, shouldn't we have more training? Well, the problem is if all you do is add hours, add training to the current policing as it currently exists, I'm very skeptical that that's going to work. Why? Well, one of the things we look at is what happens when training gets required now. That so often when training gets required now, if you look at accounts of what police academies look like, if any of you have ever been to a police academy, many of you have. If you've ever talked to police officers about their experience in the academy, kind of one of the uniform responses is, you know, the kind of sitting through like, oh gosh, another one of these. This idea that the training that they sit through is perfunctory. The training that they sit through, they don't want to be there. They're not really paying attention. And that gets reinforced with, in most police departments in the United States, once you graduate from the academy, whether it's a few weeks, a few months, whatever happened, or a few days, depending on the department. Once you graduate from the academy, you are usually placed on some sort of probation under a field training officer, who's this kind of crusty veteran, right? Who's like 3 years away from retirement. You've seen the movies, you know how this works. So what that veteran so often says, and this is to the point where this is a cliche, right? Like I've heard this from so many different officers that I've interviewed, that the most common response is that the veteran officer will say, forget everything you learned in the academy. That stuff will get you killed. This is how you go be a police officer. So if all we do is start to add more training, which again, I'm a teacher. I believe in teaching, right? Like I believe in education. I think education is important. But if all we do is add more training, then without changing any of the underlying other dynamics within policing, what you're more often than not, you're getting police officers who are resentful of having to jump through more hoops and having more things which then they just ignore as soon as they go through their field training.
Great. So thank you for sharing that perspective, Peter. So I'm going to address one question first, since it seemed to get upvoted. There was some little carrot saying, yes, we agree. And that question is asking if there's a role for social workers within addressing some of these issues. Minneapolis has really been put kind of on the map because of the George Floyd killing, and also because of their efforts to rethink some of their approaches to how policing is handled, and using potentially social workers to address various different types of crises. So my immediate response is yes, this can work, and it has worked. And there are examples across the country of how more social work leaning or interventionist crisis manager type of individuals can come to the scene of, I would say, crises to address these issues without the police. So I'll give you two examples. One that has to do with mental health, and then one that has to do with gun violence. So the first is the Kahoot, I think it's Kahoot or Kahoots program in Oregon. And so this program was started in Portland in order to address kind of the frequency in which the police were called to respond to mental health crises. And we all know that, when if you're responding to this type of crises and a person is in distress and they're acting erratically, that does present kind of this fear or this sense of threat. And when police arrive to the scene, depending on how they're trained and depending on how they're reading the situation, they may use force in order to calm that individual down or to take them in if they start making threatening behaviors. The counter or the downside, I would say, to that is it could result in uses of force that can result in death, as well as injury, as well as psychological harm and community harm. So the psychological harm to the individual, but also the community harm if they're perceiving that, these people that are clearly in distress are being dealt with aggressively, and that could erode trust. So the first student that responded in the chat mentioned the issue of trust. And so how police respond to these issues very much has ramifications for this level of trust. And the Kahoot program in Portland has been shown to be effective. There's videos you could watch online to see how it actually happens. But essentially, it's two mental health workers that have been trained to respond to these individuals. I believe they go with an EMT as well in case this individual needs some kind of medical assistance. And so it's a completely non-law enforcement response. And if law enforcement are needed to respond, then they're called. So they're really the first line of defense, and it's been shown to be effective. And what these individuals often say in response to kind of the assistance that they were receiving is that they were just having a bad day and they needed some help to kind of calm down. So that's one line of defense where a social worker or social worky type professional can be inserted into the equation. The other has to do with actual violence. And this is one of the arguments that's often made against trying to bring in kind of more social work type professionals to take over some policing or commonly thought of as policing type roles, is that their role is to respond to violent crime. So if a gun is involved, the police must necessarily be called. But there are many programs across the country. This is where my research focuses on, looking at community interventions to address gun violence. There are many interventions that use violence interventionists to de-escalate situations. And these interventionists often already have trust built within the environment that they are operating in and that they are working in, either because they've previously been engaged in the life, street life before, or because they live there and they know this individual's father, their brother. And so they could make those connections to not just de-escalate a potential situation from happening right then and there, but also de-escalating retaliation. So if police are the only response, and this is what these not just gang interventionists, but violence intervention program folks argue, is that if police are the only response and trust within police is already super tenuous, then people aren't going to cooperate. And this is what we've seen time and time again through study after study, where cynicism is high in communities, they're less likely to cooperate with the police. So these two types of interventions provide opportunities, they exist. We're not, people that are making calls for these types of professionals to intervene. It's not just kind of out of the blue. And I think it's important to know that we do have programs on record that have a proven track record to help in these situations. So that's that question. I don't know what else I've been seeing things out of the corner of my eye of stuff percolating in the chat.
So
do you want to address something now, Peter?
Yeah, if I could jump in, because I want to add something, because I saw it in the chat. So a few people did ask this question, which I think is kind of a very common response of, isn't it dangerous and isn't it too dangerous for social workers, right? So I think that, which I think is, we all want to care for, obviously, we want to protect everyone's safety. We want to protect the safety of officers. We definitely want to protect the safety of social workers and EMTs, and we're not saying that people should be put at risk. But I think that one thing to keep in mind is that if you look at the work that police officers actually do, like you literally clock their time, depending on the jurisdiction, it's not always the same, but depending on your jurisdiction, usually more than half of the time an officer is on duty, more than half of the time that they're out interacting with people in the community, They're responding to nonviolent calls for service, calls which will never have violence attached to it, or that the violence is going to be so random that you never would have predicted it anyway, right? So most of the time, most of the calls, if you look at what police officers do, they're driving around their cars waiting for a call. They get a call, they go, and it's a neighbor complaining about their neighbor, someone complaining that their neighbor's playing their music too loud, or there's a dog barking, right? Or there's a dispute about who's putting their trash cans where, right? Like if you've ever been on a ride along, any of you have ever been on a ride along, first off, if you're interested in policing, I highly recommend you go on a ride along, right? Because you can say like, oh, I study policing, but until you kind of have a sense of what it actually looks like, right? It's really hard to make conclusions about it. If you look at, if you've been on a ride along, the vast majority of the time, it's super boring. It's super boring. And they're, with the calls that they're responding to are, okay, all right, yeah, I see that's an issue. Okay, let's see if we can kind of calm the situation down. These are situations where you don't need someone with the gun and the plate and plate carrier, right? Like in bulletproof vests. This is something that you'd want someone who is trained in mental health. You'd want someone who's trained in de-escalation. And the flip side of it is Melissa and I have a colleague of ours who we went to grad school with, who likes to say that police are by their nature inherently escalating. So when we ask police to de-escalate situations, well, by the time the police show up in their bulletproof car with their bulletproof vest, with their gun, with their paramilitary style uniform, with the stance at which they approach every situation, because that's how they've been trained to approach every situation, that is inherently escalating the situation. So now you've escalated and you have to de-escalate it from there. Versus, a social worker showing up with an EMT is not escalating. So you're not trying to bring down the temperature already, because they're coming in kind of much more neutral.
Yeah, and I just want to piggyback off of some of what Peter's been saying, but also a few things that I've written down in that have come up in the chat that I also want to address. And so I've been on ride-alongs before, and I, as someone that studies gun violence and policing and responses, community responses to violence. And yes, there is so much that happens. It's boring a lot of the times, but then I've been in situations on ride-alongs where we're responding to man with a gun. And my adrenaline is like, holy moly, like something's about to go down. And that was just one ride-along. So imagine doing that every single day and having that adrenaline pump and having, those feelings and fears kind of with you on a regular basis. So there is, definitely, I think, credence to what some folks were saying in the chat, that it's important to consider the other side. And if you haven't been on a ride-along, to do that. But even if you haven't been on a ride-along, to understand, that cops are often responding to people at their worst and are coming to situations that are most often than not tense. So keep that in mind. But then the flip side of that, some people in the chat were also saying, well, we should be training people, police included, but also civilians, with how to act when police are around. And that statement, while valid and true, comes with a lot of assumptions about what it means to act right and what it means to act appropriately when police confront you. And so, as Peter was saying before, and this is how I kind of want to tie it back in, there are already assumptions and that are driven by what you hear, what you see, but also what you personally experience, that when a police comes to a situation, the situation's already escalated. And so then requiring that person to de-escalate when there's a sense of like stuff's about to get escalated, it's this funny little dance where, we're putting a lot of expectations on both parties to manage their behavior when, we have, as I was talking about earlier, we do have some people that are trained to do this type of work. And someone had mentioned also that, social workers already do a lot, and we're asking them to do a lot more. And so I think the same logic also applies to police, when we're asking them to be social workers too, as well as address violent crime, and as well as respond to these various different crises. So if we think about, reforms being able to delegate that division of labor, to be able to de-escalate some of these situations and to push people to kind of rethink whose responsibility it is to intervene in what situation, we might be able to come at, a variety of different solutions to address some of the issues that we see.
Okay, so I see a question that's come up a few times that people have mentioned that I think is worth noting. And that's this question about, is it a good idea to require more education? Is it a good idea to require a college degree? Is it a good idea to require some kind of, some people said an MSW, right? Like a master's degree to be a police officer, right? So I think that it's, again, Melissa, we're all professors. Of course, we believe in education. Of course, we believe in the value of education, the importance of education. Of course, we believe that it makes us smarter and wiser and more able to deal with different kinds of situations. But I think that one of the things that I'm aware of, and I think I'm sure a lot of you are painfully aware of, is that education is also a privilege, and it's a privilege that not everyone has access to. So while we want to have high standards for police officers, we also want to make sure that police officers can represent the communities in which they come from. And we want to make sure, and I think that we say that if we start to say that we're setting up barriers to become a police officer without addressing those barriers that exist outside of society, then we're replicating the same inequalities that exist in society, right? So I think that it's important to not view these situations in isolation, to say, okay, well, police officers should have master's degrees. So okay, does everyone have an opportunity to get a master's degree? No. Well, then what are we saying? Then are we just replicating and reproducing the same inequalities that exist otherwise?
Right.
And I like education. I'm a believer in education. I think it's important, but yeah.
And I think what Peter's saying too, just to piggyback off of that, is this assumption that a certificate or a degree or some type of professionalization will get rid of the problem, without really talking about, well, what is that training exactly? And does the training that's required for this type of work to de-escalate various types of situations, to address mental health crises, to deal with homelessness, does that require a college degree, or does it just require very pointed training on how to manage these situations? So let's see. Well, let's look at some other questions that are coming through in the chat. I'm scrolling up. Whoop. All right, I'm scrolling. Give me a second. So something that Sandra brought up is the issue of funding. And I think that's always the elephant in the room. Like, we want to do all of these things, but, how do we actually fund these different initiatives? And that is, I think, why we vote, and why we as people that can vote can help those that are in power to make these decisions, to decide kind of where we want the funding to go. And it's kind of a big black box that I don't want to get down the rabbit hole of funding to detract from some of this conversation, but I do want to acknowledge that that is a very important piece, and it is part of the conversation right now, right, of trying to redirect the precious resources that we do have within cities or within counties to help fund some of these other interventions that are not simply a law enforcement approach. But it's a very important thing, an issue to keep in mind. And I didn't want to just let it slide through the chat. Do you have anything? Is there any questions you want to address, Peter?
There's lots of questions here I'm trying to go through. So some of these are pretty specific questions, like age requirements, right? And, I think those are, I think that's useful to think about age requirements. I think there's obviously the reasons why we might be concerned that 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds are making these kind of life and death decisions, especially given what we understand about cognitive development and development of the prefrontal cortex and the ability to kind of make long-term decision making. The reasons why that we're kind of, there's good reasons to believe that people are not fully developed cognitively until they're in their mid-20s, right? So I think
especially men.
These are,
that's what the research says.
Maybe they're mid-40s in the case of men. I feel like it doesn't get there, right? But I mean, these are those kind of specific questions I think are important, right? It's important to draw those lines. It's important to figure out exactly. Those are key questions. But I think we don't want to lose sight of like the bigger issues, which is, okay, we have this moment right now where we're all focused on this, where we're all talking about this. And we're all talking about this in a way that we haven't in 20 years. Like you really have to go back to, what happened in 1992 after the LA riots, when you had a similar kind of focus on rethinking policing, when this focus on what policing should look like and the kind of specifically this guy call for things like community policing, right? And restoring trust, right? Those kinds of things you hear these echoes from the 90s. So I think that we want to keep in mind, what are the big things that we can do during this time? What are our kind of moonshot ways of rethinking policing? And when we look at what Melissa's saying about, the example of Kahoot in Portland, or also, Denver has a similar kind of program where they send out EMTs and social workers to respond to calls, that there are police departments that are making these changes. So one thing that I kind of want to address, because I saw a few people throw it out there, and that's what does defunding the police mean? Because that's a phrase that gets used a lot, right? And part of the problem is that people use it in different ways. What is police abolitionism, right? These ideas, what do they mean? So there's two ways to kind of think about it, and I'm interested in also hearing what Melissa has to say. But one way that I often think about is, yes, are there some people who are saying like close down the police departments? Sure, there are some people who are saying that. But most people are not really saying that when they say defund the police, right? Or say abolish the police. I mean, there are some who are calling for that. But what a lot of people who are saying defund the police, what they're calling for is kind of what Melissa is referring to, is this idea of shifting responsibilities away from the police. And say, okay, responding to mental health, could there be someone else who might also be equally qualified to respond to mental health calls? Responding to calls about homeless people, like sleeping in front of a store, which is a concern, right? I don't want to like diminish these concerns that people have. I've lived next to neighbors who played their music really loud and I couldn't sleep, and it woke up my kid at 2 a.m. Yeah, that sucks. It's a real issue that people should address. I'm not trying to minimize people's issues. But is the way that do we need to have this uniform response, which is sending, like, again, people with military style training to deal with it? Or might there be another way to deal with many of these kinds of calls? And there's a sociologist in New York named Alex Vitale, who wrote a book called The End of Policing. And he has this very interesting idea. And his idea is, if you think of policing as like an onion, and you start peeling away layers, peeling away responsibilities that we could give to other departments, other agencies, other actors could deal with these things. Eventually, there might be a core at the bottom that no one else is qualified or trained to do. Bank robbers, I don't know, right? Whatever it would be, right? Eventually, there might be something there that's just policing, in which case, that's what policing could be. But these other things that police do, could someone else do them instead? And if someone else could do them instead, then maybe they should. This also raises this idea of what defunding the police actually means. It doesn't even necessarily mean defunding the police. What I mean, Camden, New Jersey. So Camden, New Jersey is a famous example. Camden, New Jersey, a few years ago, they voted to abolish their police department. They said this thing can't be fixed, we're closing it. And they closed their police department. They shut down the police department. And they created a new police department that was at the county level. So new leadership, officers had to reapply if they wanted to become a police officer for this new law enforcement agency. One of the things that they did is created what are referred to as the civilian ambassadors, who are police employees. They work for the police department, but they are not sworn officers. They don't have guns, right? They're not law enforcement officers. They're not sworn, but they still work for the police department as civilians. And what you see, if you look at Camden, is the police budget actually went up. And they actually end up hiring more officers. But what they did was they shifted who's responsible for what. And you saw, and again, it's early days, and we as scholars always want to be very careful about drawing conclusions too quickly, right? Saying, oh, obviously this means this. We're still watching to see what happens. But we see complaints about excessive force just drop through the floor, right? People have much more trust in this new law enforcement agency. And we say, okay, that was an abolished police department, a defunded police department, but they actually still had more officers and more money. So when people are saying they're calling for these things, it can mean different things.
Yeah, definitely. And I want to add to that and speak to some of my own research around this idea of, how Camden, New Jersey had a long history of having a lot of violence. And so they were able to do these various different reform efforts and still bring down violent crime. And so in the case of where I did my research, which is in Richmond, California, what we saw in this city, or at least what I saw and what bore out in my own research, is that it wasn't just policing that helped bring down crime. As depending, I think, on who you talk to and what you read, you'll get multiple different narratives because people always want to say what I'm doing is working. But there was an interesting acknowledgement across everyone that I interviewed for my study, which was looking at gun violence in the city of Richmond. And it's that everyone came to the table. It was law enforcement figuring out how to really focus their efforts so they're not just saturating areas where they think a crime is about to happen, but how they're actually focusing on the people that their intelligence gathering has led them to believe that are actually doing, having guns or illegally perpetrating gun violence. But then there was also this robust growth in community services and in city-supported, and that's the important part here, city-supported services to address gun violence. So they created an Office of Violence Prevention but have been funding this Office of Violence Prevention since 2007. And after that office got started, and after there were some key changes in policing and leadership and other community interventions around reentry, around youth support services, they all kind of coalesced at the same time. And after 2010, their peak in gun violence was 2009. After that, you saw gun violence plummet. And it's not that gun violence wasn't still a thing, but it dropped dramatically. And I found it very interesting that people were willing to acknowledge the efforts of one another. And I think that's something that, as we're starting to consider more deeply and regularly, kind of what some of these alternatives are, we have case studies like Camden, we have case studies like Richmond, where police aren't gone, but there has been some serious reimagining of what it means to address violence and what it means to address crime in a way that doesn't just use the police or rely on the police as being those first responders to those types of issues. So that's my little spiel about my research. So there was something that came up around someone asked about SB 731, which was a bill that was on the table to try to figure out how to strip bad officers of their badges if they have, a history of bad behavior. It didn't end up passing the legislature, from my understanding, but it raises this important question about accountability. And I don't know, Peter, in your research, what you've seen around what works in accountability, if you have any ideas about that.
So yeah, it was a really ambitious bill. I mean, very, obviously it didn't pass, right? Or some elements of it did, but but one of the things that was really ambitious about it and was really kind of forward-looking, and California would have been at the forefront of this, was that it would, any office, this problem, this issue that's been raised across the country of problem officers being kind of shuttled from department to department, at least at the state level, would decertify officers, so that you couldn't go to just say, okay, well, I got fired from the LAPD, so I'm going to get a job in Long Beach. You couldn't just jump from department to department. That it would end, at least again, I guess they could move to Arizona, right? But at the state level, at least, would address this issue of kind of bad apples jumping around, which was really ambitious. Connecticut, so far, I think, is the only state that has passed something like that. But one of the things that it also, an element that it also had was adding real teeth to a duty to intervene. And we're going to have to wrap up pretty soon, but this is, kind of this will be my last point. So many of you might have seen something called 8 Can't Wait, and Campaign Zero has a list of kind of 8 police reforms that have been widely discussed. And one of them is what's referred to as a duty to intervene. And that would be that other officers have an obligation to intervene to stop an officer if they see one of their fellow officers employing excessive force, right? So that exists at the constitutional level anyway. Like, no one needs to pass a law. The U.S. Constitution prohibits that and requires officers to intervene. But nevertheless, what do we see is that police departments who have tried to pass a duty to intervene, well, they don't really have teeth. The example that I point to is, look at Minneapolis. Minneapolis had passed, they'd implemented President Obama's 21st century policing initiative, like every single element of it. They had created a duty to intervene. They had spent millions of dollars going through training. The Minneapolis Police Department had just been through years of reform, including an emphasis on the duty to intervene. And what you see when you watch that video, as George Floyd is being suffocated, is the other officers just standing there or helping. So having these reforms, fine, right? Creating requirements, fine. But if there aren't teeth behind it, if there aren't consequences behind it, it's very unlikely that any of them will actually achieve any kind of change. And so what Connecticut does, at least with their new law, is if you're an officer who fails to intervene to stop excessive force, then you have the same consequences if you had used the excessive force yourself, which is really dramatic, which is really different. And again, this shows that there's real change over time. Because again, I'm old enough to remember, and some of you also might be, to remember 1992 and watching the video of Rodney King as 21 officers stood by while he was beaten, right? There are changes afoot. But this belief that we can just pass these kind of legalistic changes, if we just change the rules, then that will be enough. I'm skeptical about that, unless there are some real consequences attached to it as well.
Yeah, so we have 4 minutes left. I just want to provide kind of a last thought on this issue of accountability, and to challenge us all to think about, what it means to hold police officers accountable when we look at so many other professions. And if you cause harm, if you're a doctor and you are negligent, there are consequences to that. You could lose your license. In other professions, there are consequences for negligence where you might lose your job, you might lose your license. And so I think the open question that maybe we could all ruminate on and hopefully revisit in another session in the future is, what are the types of consequences that we should also be expecting for officers? Because if we want to peel back the onion and think about how we generate that core of trust that makes policing, or that enables policing and legitimizes policing, we say that there need to be consequences for people that break the law, but we also could challenge ourselves to think about, maybe there should also be, or yes, there should be consequences for law enforcement that also do not abide by essentially their role in what they were charged and tasked with doing as officers. So I think the issue of accountability is something that, definitely warrants its own discussion. But I'm done. you all have been amazing, applauding each other, challenging each other within the chat, and bringing up some very, very important questions. If you want to wrap up and say anything else, Peter, before we end.
I think that it's tough, obviously, because we feel like we're just getting started with some of these topics, and there's a lot to go. There's a lot to do. I would ask that, I would encourage you all to, if you have questions and you want to talk about this stuff, come to office hours, email us. I think sometimes people feel like office hours, oh, I can only go to office hours if I have some very specific question about the class. No, man, that's what the syllabus is for, right? The syllabus is supposed to answer those questions. Office hours is for the tough stuff. Office hours is where we get to talk, and we get to think, and we get to ask questions. And you don't have to have a good question. You don't have to have a perfectly formulated question. You could just say, like, what do you think about what happened last week? What are your thoughts? Right? We love it when students come to our office hours and ask those kinds of questions, because it shows that you all are paying attention and you're thinking and you're trying to make connections between what you're learning in class and what's happening in the world. So if you thought this stuff was interesting and you want to come and you want to talk about these things more, please view this as the start of a conversation, not the end of it.
Yeah, I concur, and definitely come to office hours, and know too that we're still learning all of this stuff too, and our perspectives are being molded as well. And so engaging with students about these issues and with them is something that we love to do. So with that, we're at 12:59. We have a meeting after this, so we can't keep chatting. But thank you all for joining us. We'll talk about potentially hosting other discussions. I definitely do not think that the discussion stops here. So watch out for future emails.
Yes, I recorded this video, so I will post this. We will post this somewhere.
Great. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of your Thursday.